We'll start again. Philippians 1. No. We'll move on to Luke chapter 8. It was a couple of weeks ago, I had a Bible study and we were looking at that passage in Philippians. For me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And that night, the story of that line, for me to live. That's what I want us to read in this next few minutes and just look briefly at what happened. Picking up at verse 26 of Luke chapter 8. It says, "Then they sailed to the country of the Gadarenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out on the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. And he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. When he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, 'What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me.' For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for it had often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles. And he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, 'What is your name?' And he said, 'Legion,' because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain, so they begged him that he would permit them to enter them, and he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Then they went out to see what had happened, and came to Jesus, and found the man from whom the demons had departed, sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. They also who had seen it told them by what means he had been demon-possessed was healed. Then the whole multitude of the surrounding region of the Gadarenes asked him to depart from them, for they were seized with great fear. And he got into the boat and returned. Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away, saying, 'Return to your own house, and tell what great things God has done for you.' And he went his way and proclaimed throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him." Great. Just to give you a little bit of background, what's happening in this passage in Luke chapter 8, there's 4 amazing miracles that Jesus does within a matter of, we don't know exactly the time scale, but within the matter of a day or two it would be. And firstly, before this that we've just read, we have the account of where Jesus and his disciples are in the boat. They're actually on the way across Galilee when a storm arises. And Jesus is asleep. He's tired. And the disciples are afraid. They're scared stiff. And we read in that passage that they wake Jesus up, scared, fearful for their lives. And Jesus says, "You have little faith, why are you afraid?" And he stills that storm. He speaks and it stops. And he shows amazing power. He shows his human nature as well in that, really, in that he was tired. But he goes on to show his power, that he's God's Son, in the way that he stops that storm. And he shows that he has victory over nature in that. And then in this passage that we've just looked at, he shows that he has power over the demonic. He has power over demons, which is something that's quite scary for us to think about, isn't it? In some ways, we don't like to think about someone that's demon-possessed, but that's what happens here. And Jesus casts them out. Thinking about legion, in the Roman army at that time, a legion would be 6,000 men in a legion. And the demon-possessed man, or as they spoke, they said, "Call me Legion, because that's what I'm like." There would be thousands of demons in that man. It was a scary prospect. And then going on to the next rest of that chapter, we read that Jesus brings victory over sickness. There's a woman who's had blood loss for 12 years. She's done everything that she can to stop it, been to all the doctors, spent all the money trying to stop this blood loss. Nobody could do anything for her, and she's a dying woman. And she touches out as Jesus passes by one day, all in a matter of a similar time, and she's healed. Jesus doesn't even say be healed or anything like that. She just reaches out, grabs his cloak. She has faith that that is enough to heal her, and she's healed. Jesus shows that he has victory over sickness. And as he's on his way there, he's actually on his way to a man whose daughter has died, a guy called Jairus. And at the end of that chapter, we read that this girl is raised back to life. And so in the matter of a very short period of time, Jesus does these 4 amazing miracles. And he shows that really he's victorious over all things: sickness, death, nature, and even the demonic. What a person he is. And his disciples witness all of that. But I want us to focus on that bit that we've just read there and think a little bit about what is happening in that passage, and then how it fits into what I was talking about before. There's about 3 sermons here, isn't there, Sutty? To be honest. But I'll try and get through it really quickly. First thing that I want to point out about this passage is that this man is precious to Jesus. We read a bit of a description of what he's like. He is a man that nobody wanted anything to do with. He was a wild man. He didn't have any clothes on, so you wouldn't have wanted to meet him in the street. He would be frothing. He would be just ridiculously scary to meet. It says that they chained him, and there was actually people with him to stop him breaking away. He was so scary. And yet they couldn't control him. It says that he lived with the dead. He lived in tombs. And really that was a sign of what his life was like. He lived amongst the dead. Really he was like a dead man walking. He was spiritually dead. He was completely cut off from God. And yet, read that passage before, and Jesus travels across Lake Galilee to meet this one person. Even someone that had no hope in the world's sight had hope with Jesus. He was precious to him. And, you know, as we look around this room, I don't know most of your stories, but I'm guessing there's none of us that are quite... You're hiding it well if you are like that guy. But wherever we're at, we're precious to him. And sometimes we lose sight of that simple truth, don't we? But we are precious to Jesus. And we read that there's a dialogue goes on, because this guy comes out and he meets Jesus as Jesus gets out of his boat and comes onto shore. And there's a conversation goes on between Jesus and between the man. And it's very interesting that this demon-possessed man recognises who Jesus is. What does he say to Jesus? In verse 28 it says, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." Firstly, he recognises that Jesus is God's Son. He knows his name, but he recognises that he's God's Son. There's a lot of people around at that time didn't recognise that Jesus was God's Son. But this demon-possessed man did. Demonic power, and yet he knew who he was dealing with. And he knew that he'd come up against someone that was far more powerful than he was. That's the first thing. The second thing in that, and it doesn't say it in this passage, this account is actually in 2 other books in the Bible, 2 of the other Gospels. But in one of the other Gospels, it goes on to say slightly more at the end. In Matthew it says, "Do not torment me ahead of my time." That's what Legion says to him, ahead of my time. And really what he's saying in that is that he knows that his judgment day is coming. He's going to be tormented. And it's going to be Jesus that judges him. He knows there's a day of judgment coming. Even this evil, demon-possessed person knows that. And he knows that Jesus will be the one that's going to be the judge. And as we read down the passage, there's a lot of things we could pick out, but I'm going to try and move through it speedily. One of the big things I want you to think about is the fact that we read all of that about what Jesus was like, what Legion was like before he met Jesus, this wild man who you wouldn't have wanted to have anything to do with, and then we read what change happens after he's been with Jesus, after Jesus has dealt with this problem in his life. It says in verse 35, when the people came out to see what had happened, it says that they found this man sitting at the feet of Jesus, clothed and in his right mind, and they were afraid. That's the change that happened. He went from being completely out of his mind to being in his right mind. He'd met with Jesus. And tonight, again, wherever we're at, we need to have met with Jesus. We need to have had that encounter with him, and that can come in many different forms, but simply it is bowing the knee and asking Jesus to forgive us and to be Lord of our lives. And I wonder whether we have had that encounter in our lives at some point where we've realised that we're not worthy of him, and we've humbled ourselves and we've come to him. Because a lot of the Christian walk is about humbling ourselves and allowing him to live through us. That's what this is all about. And that's something that it's easy for me to say in the pulpit and not easy for me to do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. It's easy to talk about and not easy to live every day. But that's what we're called to do. And as we read down towards the end of the passage, we read that there's a number of different people come. But what is their response as they see what's happened? We read that they send Jesus away. And I always thought, as I heard this story growing up, that they sent Jesus away because the pigs had died. I thought, well, the farmers won't be happy, will they? I suppose I'd looked at it from that side of it. They've lost all their pigs. I think it's in Mark, it suggests that there's about 2,000 pigs that go into this lake and die. Big loss, isn't it? And that's what I just presumed it was. That's why they sent him away. But actually it says that when they saw the man and they saw the change that had happened in him, they were very fearful. There was great fear that struck them. They were afraid because they come across Jesus. They weren't afraid because of the pigs. That's not what it says. It says that it was because of his power. And they'd come up against somebody that scared them. And I wonder whether sometimes when we think about who Jesus is, whether that makes us afraid. We think about the way that he moved and worked, and that makes us afraid. Maybe we're afraid to give him control of our lives. I think sometimes, if I'm honest, I want to keep control of certain areas of my life, and I'm afraid of what he might do. Even though he knows me better than I know myself and he wants that of me, I can be afraid of doing that. And as we come to the last bit really is what I think illustrates what I was talking about before. Verse 38, I'll read it again. It says, "Now the man from whom the demons had departed begged him," that is Jesus, "that he might be with him. But Jesus sent him away." This man had met with Jesus, and he wanted to be with him. He wanted to go with him, he wanted to follow him, he wanted to listen to him, he wanted to see everything he did, he wanted to be in his presence all the time. That was his longing, because he'd had this encounter with Jesus. When we become a Christian, I hope we should have a longing to be with him. And ultimately that's to be with him forever in heaven, where there's no pain, there's none of the world's distractions. It's to be with him all the time, enjoying his presence and everything that comes with that. And yet what does Jesus say to him? It says, Jesus sent him away saying, "Return to your own house and tell what great things God has done for you." So that's what he did. He went his own way, proclaiming throughout the whole city what great things Jesus had done for him. And I think really simply that illustrates, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. To die is better for us. Once we're saved, Paul had an assurance. That's why he said to die is gain. He had an assurance that he would go to heaven when he died. And he knew that wholeheartedly. When we're saved, we should have that assurance. If we don't, God will give it if we pray and seek him. He will give us an assurance. But he has something for us to do now. And that, you think about what Paul went through. It says in 2 Corinthians 11, some of the things that he went through. It says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews 40 lashes, less one. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. And it goes on and on about the things that he went through. And yet, he recognised that God wanted him to be a witness and to be used. For me to live is Christ, he said. And that meant joining Christ in his suffering and yet being used by him. And really, in closing, I wonder what it means for us, for me to live. What is it that this week we're going to be living for? Am I going to be living for Christ? What does that look like each day? I want to suggest that every day, as it tells us in Romans 12, 1 and 2, to be living daily as a sacrifice for the Lord, to allow him to have control every day. That's what I think it's about. Each day coming to the foot of the cross, even kneeling down. We don't often kneel, do we? That's humbling, isn't it, kneeling? Getting down and kneeling and asking God to work through us that day, for Christ to work through you and me by his Spirit in that day. And that doesn't mean everything's going to be easy. It wasn't for Paul, was it? But he was living the life that God wanted him to when he did that. As we go away, for me to live is Christ, can we say that? And to die is gain. That's what I want to share with you. Sorry I've been a little bit longer. We're going to close by singing.